Good morning. I'm Sister Simone Campbell. I understand our bios are in your handy-dandy app, so we won't go into all those details. But I'm here with Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice, and I'm really honored to be a part of this panel. My job is moderator, so I get to be timekeeper, which is going to be a super big challenge because we've got so much to talk about. So if I'm a Budinsky, it's only because I want to move us along. What we're going to do is look at two aspects of our work. First is substantively on three topics: on immigration, on criminal justice, and domestic human needs, what's happening on the Hill. Then we're going to look at how that actually plays out in life, in advocacy, especially in the interfaith community, and then close with a recommendation, something to remember as you go home. So that's a lot to pack into about 40 minutes, so we're all in our most disciplined, focused state, because we're used to lobbying on Capitol Hill, where you're lucky to get 15 minutes. The Washington Interreligious Staff Community is the body that, or amoeba, as I like to say, that brings together the interfaith community in DC. We have 74 faith-based organizations that are a part of us, and we work in 19 different working groups. Everything from the environment, issues of Cuba, issues of international funding for international affairs, domestic human needs, criminal justice reform. We have a long litany of issues that we work on in these very active working groups. Additionally, we meet once a month as an entire interreligious community to do an education piece. The one that's coming up this month is going to be on voting rights, using the new movie that Stacey Abrams' production folks recently released, and talking about the essence of democracy. And then we also meet in this organization called Heads of Washington Offices, which Melanie's a part of, and the heads, affectionately known as HOWO. I wish we had better initials, but we don't, so we just call ourselves HOWO. And we meet together to talk about shared concerns leading interfaith work in the DC area. This has led us at times to taking action as the entire WISC community. So a couple weeks ago, we do an annual retreat day where we take time together as the full community to reflect on our work, share some aspect of development, and move forward. What we've discovered is critical to create community across faith lines. Now, you all had your resolutions last night, I understand, and you understand the challenge of moving forward together. Well, when you multiply that by the number of faith groups that we have together, it's a little challenging, and sometimes it can be a little slow. But to our immense joy, it has led to our effectiveness because we've been able to come together and move forward. So that's who we are, and we've been at this since 1960s when we started this the Religious Action Center for Reformed Judaism was a key beginner of the Washington Interreligious Staff Community because it was in the days of civil rights that all this got started and then has expanded. So we're honored to carry on that legacy. It is really critical. So now, three of my partners in this, in our WISC community are going to talk to you about various topics. And Katie Adams, who is let me get this right, the policy advocate for domestic human needs for the United Church of Christ, is going to share with us about what's happening on the immigration front. Katie?
Hi, everyone. So I've got 5 minutes to talk about immigration. So pardon me if I breeze through. I want to start by talking about the Interfaith Immigration Coalition. I have the honor of being the co-chair of the coalition, and it's made up of 55 national faith-based organizations, and we're committed to enacting fair and humane immigration reform that reflects our mandate to welcome the stranger and treat all human beings with dignity and respect. We work together to advocate for just and equitable immigration policies educate faith communities, and serve immigrant populations around the country. And I'm sure all of you are aware, the state of play seems pretty dire. Attacks on immigration have come from all fronts over the past few years. Each week seemingly brings a new regulation or rollback in immigration access or protection for immigrants. The use of the regulatory and rulemaking process and the broad power of the executive have made it so that the administration moves forward with broad immigration changes with little to no ability for the public to push back. That's why you maybe have seen a lot of action alerts asking you to comment on regulations rather than addressing Congress directly. We look at immigration from a few angles, and I know all of you have been doing work in this area, and we break it down into a few broad categories which intersect with each other. So we focus on creating a pathway to citizenship for Dreamers and TPS recipients, reducing funding for deportation, detention, and border militarization, and reducing immigrant detention and exerting stronger oversight over existing practices, restoring the U.S. commitment to resettle refugees and uphold our legal and moral obligations to asylum seekers, expanding access to family-based immigration, remedying the root causes of forced migration, enacting more robust congressional oversight, and holding agencies like ICE and CBP accountable. One critical component to how we approach immigration is an understanding that something that hurts one immigrant population hurts us all. We can't sink into the mire of pitting one group against each other. So we advocate for a path to citizenship for Dreamers. We advocate for protection and expansion of refugee resettlement. We seek to overturn the cruel policies of the past that allow for families to be separated and people to be held in detention for no reason. We seek to do all of these in concert with each other. Some of the current work we've been doing, just this past month, the Interfaith Immigration Coalition held a National Day of Prayer and launched a website and toolkit for religious communities called Faith for Asylum. Check it out. And it was released on the anniversary of the Migrant Protection Protocols, a real misnomer of a program, which is a policy that forces asylum seekers to remain in Mexico while their asylum case is being adjudicated and before they can present themselves for asylum. Those prayer vigils were held in a variety of faith communities in Washington, D.C., Arizona, Indiana, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Montana, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, Texas, as well as virtually. We also do a substantial amount of work in the appropriation space, whether it's the Muslim ban, changing access for asylum seekers, forcibly separating children from their parents, deporting our neighbors, detaining and incarcerating immigrants, and running roughshod over border communities. The administration has mismanaged federal tax dollars and undermined U.S. moral leadership. So we continue to push congressional appropriators to use the power of the purse to rein in these policies. There's a lot to cover, which is why I took detailed notes.
But I'm going. You only have a minute.
And then in other kind of, in the refugee space, we are supporting the No Ban Act and the Grace Act. Together, these two bills would immediately end the current bans in place and enact more limits so Congress can stop the discriminatory bans from being implemented and establish a minimum number of annual refugee arrivals. So that's just kind of a broad overview of the work that we're doing, but it kind of gives you a glimpse into the coordination that interfaith spaces have done. So,
is there a website where people can get more information?
interfaithimmigration.org. And I have to point out that my fellow co-chair, Faith Williams, is right in the front here, and she's wonderful.
Thank you so much, Katie. It is sort of a rush, but you see the complexity and breadth of the work that needs to be done. And do check out interfaithimmigration.org for the full list of everything they're involved in. So second, we're going to go to Reverend Aundreia Alexander, who is, I have to get your title correct, Associate General Secretary for Joint Action and Advocacy for the National Council of Churches, and a great preacher. So,
Amen. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for actually inviting me for a second time. So I was here a couple of years ago with Amelia and Rabbi Pessner, who is a great friend of ours. The National Council of Churches is a coalition of 38 Protestant Christian denominations that does all of its work in partnership with one another, and interfaith and civil and human rights coalitions to make this world what we, in the United States in particular, what we dream and hope it to be. One of the coalitions that I work closely with, and I am immediate past co-chair for the Interfaith Criminal Justice Coalition. And that work, very similar to what Katie said regarding immigration work, is we are doing everything from dealing with attempting to create laws that we think are better, working on those that are before us, and also addressing the intersectionality of criminal justice related issues in all the other areas, such as budgeting. The National Council of Churches in 2018, on the day of the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's martyrdom, we came together with faith communities throughout the country, and particularly in DC, and launched a racial justice campaign. That racial justice campaign we coined as ACT Now to End Racism, ACT standing for Awaken, Confront, and Transform. Transform being individuals and the systems and structures that perpetuate racial injustice. And we also thought it was extremely important. You can't do racial justice issues in a vacuum. We can't go, we're going to deal with racism, but we don't acknowledge or understand systemic racism within the various areas of work that we do. The criminal justice, or the penal system, what I call it, is really just birthed out of the history of controlling particularly people of color's bodies. And so we've gotten really, really deep, and it's going to take a lot of work to get out of that hole. Last year, well, actually 2 years ago now, it was, this is 2020, the end of 2018, there was a huge fight, and it was a fight, I will call it that. Sister Simone and I always talk about language. I'm Baptist, we fight. But anyway, the First Step Act passed. However, we opposed it, and I was very happy that JCPA was partnered with us in that opposition. That opposition was based on the fact that if you're going to make a real dent in the mass incarceration arena, we have to begin to look at things like how we define violent offenses, and also acknowledge the intersectionality of racism in those systems. And if you're going to create a new law that does not address that, then we're just, it's like anything else, we're just, switching up the pieces and on the chessboard, and nobody's winning. So one of the things I understand that you all will be looking at is the REAL Act, for instance, which we do like, the Restore Education, oh God, what is I keep forgetting what the A is, Restore Education and something Learning Act. But the reality is it basically restores Pell Grants to individuals who are in prison. If we want to make a difference, the issues that underlie mostly the criminal justice issue has a whole lot to do with poverty and race. And if you can't access things that make your life better, the other issue, and some of these things take place in things like what Amelia will talk about with access to social services. People come out of prison, or they're going into prison. Part of it has to do with access to housing, access to education, access to social services. We can't, again, do these things in a vacuum. How much time do I have? Not much, I would imagine. No. None. Okay. What I will encourage, just as educational purpose, if anyone has not seen Just Mercy or read the book, please do. Another book I would really encourage as far as resources is Until We Reckon by Danielle Sereid, who is a activist that deals with issues around how we define, again, violence. We can't keep carving out, quote unquote, you'll get this, but it has to be a nonviolent crime. Even the definition of violence in many cases really center around issues that have a much more disparate impact, again, on people of color and poor people. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Aundreia. And that is a good look at the passion and the systems behind it, which is so
Yes.
critical in the criminal justice work. Next, we're going to hear from Amelia Kegan, the Legislative Director for Domestic Policy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and she's going to talk about the work of the Domestic Human Needs Working Group. Amelia.
Thanks. So first, I just want to say what a huge privilege it is to be here with all of you, and thank you for coming to Washington, for all the work that you do in your communities. I know we'll probably touch on this later, but coming to your members of Congress from that faith perspective is unique, especially in Washington, and it holds a lot of power. So thank you for the work that you do and for bringing that voice to your elected officials. So DHN is the Interreligious Working Group on Domestic Human Needs. It's the oldest WISC working group, and so we work on issues around poverty and economic justice. So I thought I might just quickly review what is DHN doing right now and responding to what's going on right now. And then, as you all know, this is 2020. It is an election year, and so preparing for what can we be laying the groundwork for 2021 and beyond. So quickly, as you all know, there have been a lot of executive orders that have come out in the past, just this past year. And so DHN has been spending a lot of time responding to those executive orders and seeing it as a kind of holistic framing. Executive orders that have really gone after our social safety net. So three on the SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, housing discrimination, immigrant families in public housing, changing how we measure and define the poverty line that would kind of force many people off of assistance programs. So responding to all of these executive orders has been a big piece of what DHN has been doing. And I know that many of you have been submitting comments as well, and I want to say how powerful that is and important that is, because when you are able to bring kind of the direct impacts of how these regulations would play out on the ground, that is particularly powerful and carries a lot of weight and can help in the process, slow down the process, and in litigation as well. And so I know a number of people just want to kind of copy and paste a submitted comment, but that actually doesn't carry much weight. It is much more powerful when you're able to kind of do that individual, submitting that individual comment. So thank you for doing that, and I just want to emphasize how that is particularly powerful, and we're always looking for people to do that. So we've got the regulations. The other thing that just came out yesterday, you've been reading in the news, is the president released his budget, right? And we always talk about the budget being a unique place for people of faith to comment on, the budget being a moral document outlining our values and priorities as a country. And so for the faith community has long kind of spoken out with a faithful budget that Simone has been very engaged in, and the WISC community has put together. And so I will just flag, I'm sure you've been reading the news reports, but I'll flag a couple things in the president's budget. Cutting SNAP by more than $180 billion over the next decade would cause millions of people to lose health coverage, slashing Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act tax credits by $1 trillion over the next 10 years. Cuts to TANF by over $15 billion over the next decade, and cuts to disability programs by $20 billion over the same period. Now, we know that this budget, it's not going to be enacted into law, right? But it does show a roadmap for where we know that the administration is trying to go, and what we have seen in past budgets is sometimes it is foreshadowing what they plan to do with executive orders. And so that's why we're paying attention to what is in this budget and what it's saying so that we can be equipped to push back on that. The final thing that I'll mention that we're going to be working on immediately is this long process of the appropriations process, which while it starts with the release of the president's budget, we know that the final decisions probably won't be made until after the elections in the lame duck session. That being said, the continued advocacy is really important, because if we wait until that lame duck session, it's too late, right? A lot of those deals have already been made. So it's really important to continue to talk about a lot of the needs that you see in your communities and how well poised you are to talk about that. I will say that in 2019, we had some really good wins. We actually saw some significant increases for housing assistance, for child care assistance, and so the appropriations process is potentially a place where we can see wins. So finally, because I know I'm running out of time, I just want to share kind of where we're kind of laying the groundwork for next year. And I want to share one very quick thing. So last Monday was my first day back from maternity leave. And thanks, yeah. So, but it was also 4 years to the day that I started at FCNL, my current organization. And if you had told me 4 years ago that I would be coming back 4 years from then from maternity leave to a Congress that was in the middle of an impeachment of a President Trump, I would not have believed you, right? I would not, and it just is a reminder to me of how much can change in a short period of time, right? And so Amen. As we look towards laying the groundwork for 2021 and 2024 and 2025 and beyond, that's kind of given me hope of where can we be. And so that's what we're looking at. And I want to flag, there's a lot that we kind of want to lay.
And we only have
okay, I'll just say
seconds.
The Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit are America's largest anti-poverty programs, but currently leave out millions of people. There are 26 million kids who can't claim the full child tax credit because their parents don't earn enough, and 5 million people are taxed into or deeper into poverty because they don't earn enough for the Earned Income Tax Credit.
Great, and I'm sure you can weave the rest of them into our conversation. Yes. So let's have a conversation a bit about what does it mean in each of our areas to work in the interfaith community. How is that? How have you seen it work with members of Congress and their staff? What do you think some of the strengths are or some of the challenges? What do you think?
I would say that the faith voice is extremely important. And we had this conversation in our prep call. I mean, you guys are doing this, but one of the things I will say that's really important is to stand unapologetically strong in your faith. You don't have to know all the statistics. You know, that's always good because mostly, a lot of times people are going to share things that are not true. And it's helpful if you have some facts to back it up. But mostly what you bring is your voice and your faith.
Amen.
And I say unapologetically because there is this way, there are some voices, it just like makes me shiver whenever I hear anyone say, well, the people say, or the American people, or people of faith say, and I'm thinking, you didn't represent anything that I believe, or many people that I am engaged with believe. So I just want to say that there is something, and when having in the meetings, that's something that they really appreciate, believe it or not, actually. I've said at many tables, one great story. Senator Grassley wanted to have nothing to do with anything around criminal justice reform. But a faith community in Iowa wrote a letter that got placed in the Des Moines Register with over 140 faith leaders. Now, he bemoaned and screamed and hollered and wrote his own op-ed, but then he called us to meet with him. And he ended up being one of the greatest champions on criminal justice reform. And again, I'm Baptist. We believe in conversion experiences. So I'm always like, he is like the poster child that it can happen.
And now we have a list of who we want it to happen to.
Yes, yes.
Katie, I'm curious, as you do the immigration work, how has the interfaith reality played out for Interfaith Immigration Coalition?
I mean, there's two kind of components. I think one, the faith aspect and interfaith, it gets us in the door. We are able to have conversations with members on the Hill that a lot of our secular partners aren't, because we say we're coming from a faith perspective. And, you know, over the past year, we've had some really great meetings with appropriation staff from both sides of the aisle that kind of let us in the door. We have a great conversation. And, you know, we go back and speak to some of our partners, and they're like, you got in to meet with them? And we're like, oh, yeah, you know. And I think, you know, the faith aspect, but it's so much, you know, it gets us in the door. But the reason we're there, I think, is so much deeper. And in the immigration space, faith communities have a really important role to play, especially now. I think there's such deep hurt. And so while we're here and we do policy, we remember behind each of the numbers about refugees or people who are in detention, those are humans and stories, and our faith is what really binds us together to talk about those stories. And I think that in my faith tradition, we talk about kind of pastoral care. And I think that there's a deep need for that right now in the immigration space, of faith communities coming together. And how do we respond to the immense pain right now? And how do we hold immigrant communities and say, no matter what, we are here, and we are here for you, and we stand with you. And as we move forward into, you know, talking about, you know, the election and talking about what happens after the election, right now, that is what faith communities need to be doing.
Amen. Good point. And Amelia, for domestic human needs, working on the issues of poverty and safety net, I mean, it's at the heart of many of our faith traditions. How have you found it to be a value add in the advocacy work that we do?
I think, I mean, similar to a number of these issues, coming together in this interfaith work, we come and say, listen, we disagree on some major things, right? But the core tenets of our scriptures are all the same when it comes to these certain fundamental values,
right,
like welcoming the stranger, like prioritizing the needs of vulnerable and poor communities. And so that is incredibly powerful. And I think especially when we come in being moved by something greater than ourselves, that is not something that most lobbyists are doing on Capitol Hill,
Amen.
Right? But that's something you are doing. That's something that we as people of the faith community are doing. And that's like a breath of fresh air for a number of staffers. I mean, many staffers don't go to work on Capitol Hill to make big bucks, right? They go because a lot of them are really interested in public service. And so being able to connect in that way. We also come with a certain sort of credibility. And we know that when we're walking into an office, unlike some other organizations and groups, we're not there to help you get reelected or try and defeat your boss. Like that we're not interested in that. We don't play that game. We're about the policies and the values that underline those policies and trying to get that through. And we work with whoever will help make that happen, right? And so coming in that same way, as Katie was saying, it allows us to get in the door and establish relationships with a much broader range of congressional offices.
Amen. And I want to point out, because I know many of you work in direct service places, that how critical it is when you come to bring the stories or bring the people who've experienced the issues. Because one of the things that happens often on the Hill is that both staff and the members themselves have no contact with folks who experience the consequences of their choices. And so a lot of what I say to folks, I do this thing, Nuns on the Bus, and so I always say to representatives, come meet my people, come meet my people. Because once you meet the people, then hearts are changed. And if you change hearts, that's when you change heads. So I set out to break hearts before I tried breaking heads, though I do it in a nonviolent way, which is what Aundreia and I get into the conversation about. Well, I'm curious as to the impact of doing this the interfaith work. Do you have any advice for folks here in the room, how they, kind of best practices, things to be mindful of, something that you would want everybody to carry home with them that you've learned from our various experiences? Any stories? Katie, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I always recommend to folks is when you're talking to members of Congress, look for unlikely allies and unexpected partnerships. Because we're people of faith and because we believe in the humanity and dignity of everyone, that means that extends to people that we maybe don't agree with. And so, I get very frustrated. I am a person that I have to remember that all the time. And so I think one piece of advice that I give to everyone who goes onto the Hill is remembering that the person you're talking to, who may say some things that are really hateful and hurtful, is still someone who is, deserving of human dignity and respect. And that helps frame it for me. Again, in my faith tradition, I tell people, you are a beloved child of God, and so is the person you're speaking to. And that is a good framing for me to keep in mind as I talk to members and, from that faith perspective.
You're not going to vote them off the island. That's good. That's good. Amelia, what would be your words of wisdom?
I would say don't worry about having all the facts or all the data points. Come bringing your story, and do not shy away from leaning in on your faith. I remember this one time where a group of religious leaders came into an office. It was during the kind of deficit hysteria. There were all those conversations happening in Congress to get a big deficit reduction deal. And there was a meeting with a senator, and that senator, as often, was running late and was meeting with a really big interest group and was apparently getting kind of attacked in that meeting, and comes in all flustered, late, and we've started with the staff member, and the senator comes in, and some of the faith leaders say, let's just stop for a moment, and can we pray together? And it totally changed the atmosphere in that meeting. And I think some real relationship building happened there. And it's talking about kind of some of that pastoral care, too, for that senator who was dealing with a lot at that time. And we were able to have, I think, a much more productive meeting because we're the place that we all were. And so I would say don't shy away from bringing your faith into those meetings and into those conversations, because it is so powerful.
Amen.
I would just expound upon that. I mean, when we say being unapologetic, I remember a group of us going, and we were outside of the chamber where senators were going to vote to remove the health care bill a couple of years ago. And we actually prayed with people, and some senators heard we were there and actually came and just asked for prayer. I remember Senator Coons had just had a call from a friend who had the wife of a friend who died. It was a good friend, and he just needed prayer. Yeah. And then from another standpoint, I remember also being in a meeting with Senator Claire McCaskill, and they were voting on the DREAM Act. We had a dreamer with us. Actually, it was her staffer. And my cousin actually used to be her legislative aide that would have met with us. So I called him and said, what should we do? He said, look, if I was there and I was advising her, this wouldn't be a good bill for her. And what I appreciated is her staffer pretty much said that. And we had a dreamer with us. And he says, he says, well, she's just, praying to her God and, trying to understand what the call is. And this is what I said, Sister Simone. I said, we're going to pray with her and for her. I am going to pray that her spirit will trouble her and that she will be challenged, because leadership means doing things that are not always safe.
Amen.
And yes, I prayed that. I prayed for her. I also had sleepless nights because I knew the impact that bill was going to have on those young people. Now, the bill did not pass, but Senator McClare was one of the 55 senators that voted for it.
Yep.
I'm not saying it was our prayers, but
Parting
it could
seas,
be. Exactly.
Yeah.
God has done much greater things.
Well, this has been a chance to give you a window onto the interfaith, interreligious staff working groups in DC on their work that you all make possible. Because I want you to know that we hear your stories that are brought through JCPA to the whole work that we do on the Hill. And all of our faith traditions come together to find a shared way forward. And I think that that critical work is to show that our values are solid together in making our nation what we hunger for it to be. A nation where we can live in our faith in freedom, as well as everyone else can live in freedom, and the cares of the immigrants, the cares of the marginalized, and the cares of the racist history that we bear witness to might be realized in a new flowering, a new creation. And I often refer to this time as a time of maybe a new Genesis, where the Spirit of the Lord, the Ruah of God, breathes over these waters of chaos and hopefully brings forth a new creation. Thank you for this opportunity.